Hi guys, welcome back to Semi Store. Today, the screenly readers. Deleted Rose's plenty of look.
Young and the Restless reveal that Sharon had never imagined she would stand at the edge of an abyss like this in Genoa City, a place where she had rebuilt herself after heartbreak more times than she could count. But this time was different. This wasn't a romantic misstep that time could soften, or a misunderstanding that could be patched with apologies. This was a kidnapping. A cold, prosecutable act with a name attached to it, and that name was Mariah Copeland, the daughter Sharon had believed had already fought long enough just to earn the right to breathe without fear. When the truth detonated that Mariah had abducted Dominic Winters, Sharon felt as if the final protective curtain in her life had been ripped away, exposing every delay, every blind spot, every choice she had once excused. As a mother, she couldn't help but feel guilty, and perhaps she deserved to. This guilt wasn't abstract anymore. It had shape and weight. It had a child's cries, a family's devastation, and the inevitable eyes of judgment gathering beyond the horizon. Sharon replayed the years in her head, the moments Mariah had been stubborn, distant, impossible to reach, the signals Sharon might have missed. The way everything had been swept off course by the turmoil surrounding Noah Newman in Los Angeles. Sharon understood she had been pulled into that chaos. That one crisis had bled into another. But none of that changed the most terrifying fact. She should have reached for her daughter sooner. She should have stayed closer. She should have asked more questions, pressed harder, refused to let the silence between them become a hiding place for something dark to grow. While Sharon wrestled with the crushing realization that she was both a mother and, in this moment, a failure, another pressure closed in from every side. Someone had to protect Mariah. Not in the emotional sense of shielding her with love, but in the brutal, procedural sense, protecting her with law, strategy, closed courtroom doors, and the kind of questions that cut like glass. Sharon knew a mother's devotion couldn't stand in front of a judge and demand mercy. Love couldn't erase evidence. Love couldn't reverse the fact that Dominic had been taken. And Sharon also knew more clearly than ever that anything connected to Dominic would drag a massive shadow into the room, Victor Newman. Dominic wasn't just a child. He was the living center of Abby and Devon's grief, a symbol of shattered trust, a spark that could ignite Victor's wrath into something merciless. Sharon could see it in her mind like lightning massing over the city. Victor's fury would not only target Mariah, it would scorch anyone who dared to stand beside her. And in her desperation, Sharon thought of Michael Baldwin. Michael Baldwin was the name that surfaced when Genoa City crossed into legal darkness, when someone needed a mind sharp enough to carve out a narrow exit and strong enough to withstand pressure from the most powerful families in town. Sharon went to him not with confidence, but with the raw panic of a woman running out of time. She carried fear like a heavy coat, the dread that every door would slam shut the moment Mariah's identity and actions were fully exposed. She didn't come to tell a dramatic story. She came because the hearing was approaching, because each eye that passed pulled Mariah closer to a sentence that could swallow her whole. Sharon clung to Michael like a final plank in a violent current, knowing it might not hold, but having nothing else to grab. Michael listened, and the way he listened was what chilled Sharon most. It wasn't the silence of sympathy. It was the silence of a lawyer assembling a case in his head and seeing walls thick enough to break bones. He didn't need to dramatize the stakes. Sharon already understood why this case was so complex it felt almost impossible. Mariah had kidnapped Dominic. Mariah carried a history that was not simple, not clean, not easy to explain in a courtroom. And Mariah, whether fairly or not, would be seen as the woman who stole Victor Newman's grandchild. In Genoa City, that single phrasing could turn the entire town into a jury before the trial even began. Sharon knew asking Michael to defend Mariah meant pulling him into a war not only against the prosecution, but against public rage, against family power. and against the instinct for vengeance that was already burning in the hearts of those who loved Dominic. Then the thing that both relieved Sharon and terrified her happened. Michael agreed to take Mariah's case, but his yes was not a gentle rescue. It came with conditions that felt like ropes tightening around Sharon's throat. Michael did not offer her the comfort of choosing what to reveal and what to protect. He demanded total cooperation, and total from Michael Baldwin was never a casual word. Sharon and Tessa would have to open every door, place everything on the table, refuse every impulse to soften the truth, and surrender every secret that could later return like a weapon in court. Michael required them to disclose Mariah's full history of mental illness, every diagnosis, every episode, every detail they might prefer to keep private. Not to humiliate her, not to satisfy anyone's curiosity, but to build the only defense Michael could see with even a chance of survival, a strategy grounded in Mariah's unstable mental state. Yet that path carried its own cruelty. It meant turning the most intimate parts of Mariah's suffering into legal material. It meant letting strangers examine her pain like evidence. Sharon heard each demand as if she were being forced to swallow shards of glass. Part of her wanted to protect Mariah in the most instinctive way possible, to keep her from being stripped bare in front of a city that loved to label and punish. Sharon feared that exposing Mariah's mental health history would not only shake the legal case, but also freeze Mariah forever in the public mind as damaged, dangerous, or crazy. Sharon feared the whispers, the smug certainty of people who would say she was always like that. And Sharon feared something deeper still, the shame of admitting out loud, on record, that she had known her daughter carried cracks in her soul and yet hadn't stayed close enough to protect her from what might slip through those cracks. Sharon's guilt became sharp and specific. It wasn't only about the kidnapping, it was about every moment she had chosen another emergency over checking in on Mariah. Every day she had let distance become normal because life felt too chaotic to correct it. Tessa wasn't spared by any of this. For her, Mariah wasn't a headline or a case file. She was her wife, the person Tessa had chosen, trusted, and built her future around. Now that future hung above a courtroom like a blade, and Tessa was being asked to dig into the private history of the woman she loved and hand it to a defense strategy. The pressure on Tessa was brutal. If she cooperated, she might feel as if she was exposing Mariah. If she resisted, she could destroy Mariah's only real chance to avoid being swallowed by the system. Tessa stood between two kinds of loyalty to Mariah's privacy and dignity, and loyalty to Mariah's freedom. Each option hurt, each required sacrifice. In the room with Sharon and Michael, tension didn't need shouting to exist. It lived in every breath that tightened, every glance that dropped, every time Sharon's hands clenched as if she could hold something together simply by squeezing hard enough. Michael, shaped by years of legal warfare, did not let emotion steer the ship. That didn't mean he was heartless. It meant he knew that if they let feelings take over, they would lose. He made it clear he needed everything about Mariah's connection to Ian Ward. That name landed like a hook in Sharon's chest, dragging up memories she had spent years trying not to relive. Michael needed the full story, how Mariah had been influenced, manipulated, pulled into a web she might not have had the strength to escape, and what signs proved her mental state had collapsed beyond stability. He didn't need vague generalities, he needed specifics. He wasn't building drama. He was building a structure that could stand in court against prosecutors and against the rage of those who felt robbed of safety and innocence. He looked at Sharon and Tessa as the two most crucial witnesses, the two living vaults of information, and he warned them plainly if they hid anything, the other side would find it and use it like a hammer to smash every defense they tried to raise. That blunt honesty forced Sharon into the corner she had been trying to avoid. She wanted to believe there was a way to protect Mariah and still preserve something private, something sacred. But Michael's logic was merciless. In a courtroom, every gap becomes an invitation for the worst interpretation. Sharon began to understand that protecting Mariah could no longer mean protecting her with silence. It meant stepping into the battlefield and accepting that the truth, no matter how painful, might be the only weapon they had. Yet understanding did not erase the pain. Sharon ached at the thought of packaging her daughter's suffering into an argument. She ached knowing Victor Newman would treat any attempt at defense as an insult to his family. She ached most because she realized, with crushing clarity, that if this was the only path left, it meant other paths had been lost long ago through distance, through distraction, through the simple human failure of not reaching out when it mattered most. Sharon's reluctance was not a small hesitation. It was an internal war between maternal instinct and legal reality. She looked at Michael as if he were holding a surgical blade, telling her the only way to save Mariah was to cut deeply into the part that hurt most. Sharon didn't want that. But Sharon didn't have the luxury of wanting. The person who would pay the price was Mariah. And in that moment, Sharon felt herself age. She understood that motherhood was not only love and sacrifice. Sometimes it was choosing between two kinds of agony and choosing the one less likely to kill your child. She finally nodded, and that nod felt like surrender, like confession, like a promise to do the thing that might make her hated, misunderstood, and haunted if it kept Mariah alive in the world. Tessa had to follow that decision too. She knew Mariah might feel betrayed if the secrets were exposed, but she also knew Mariah would not survive this process if they walked into court with half-truths and careful evasions. Tessa forced herself into a kind of strength she hadn't known she could carry, not the strength of numbness, but the strength of enduring cruelty in the name of hope. Loving Mariah suddenly felt heavier, like holding someone who is falling and choosing to pull them up even when it tears your hands apart. From that point forward, Sharon and Tessa were no longer preparing for an emotional fallout. They were preparing for legal war. Nobody said, "Tomorrow will be fine." They only faced the grim truth. Tomorrow had to be survived. In Genoa City, a town where secrets never stay silent for long, Sharon could feel the next stage forming around them like a storm. Once this case reached the courtroom, it would not simply be about Dominic's kidnapping. It would become a trial of choices and failures, of Mariah's past, of Sharon's role as a mother, of Tessa's devotion, of public judgment, and of the rage Victor Newman would inevitably bring. Michael had agreed to represent Mariah, but Sharon understood that agreement was only the beginning. Every detail they provided could either rescue Mariah or bury her. Every secret revealed could become a shield or a blade turned back on them. Sharon tried to tell herself she was doing the right thing, but right in this town always came with a cost that felt unbearable. When Sharon left Michael's office, she felt as if she had signed a contract with fate. Disclose everything, endure everything, risk everything. She knew she would have to face Mariah, face Tessa, face her own shame, and face a city that rarely forgave. But she also knew that if she refused this path, Mariah would fall with no net. Sharon walked away with legs heavy as stone, carrying fear and a thin, fragile strand of hope Michael had not offered as comfort, but as a harsh condition. And then a colder thought slid through Sharon's mind, sharp enough to steal her breath. If Michael demanded everything about Ian Ward, then there were pieces of Mariah's story even Sharon might not fully know, pieces that could decide whether the court would see Mariah as a victim of manipulation or as someone who chose this darkness willingly. Sharon swallowed hard, realizing the true hook of this nightmare wasn't the trial itself. It was what might surface when they finally opened the last locked door, and how quickly one hidden truth could collapse Michael's entire defense in a single heartbeat. Sharon had always believed she understood what a crisis looked like in Genoa City, because this town never runs out of scandal, never runs out of falls that force people to learn how to stand again in silence. But there are moments when every lesson you've ever learned becomes useless because it hits the rawest instinct in you, the one place you can't armor no matter how hard you try. For Sharon, that place was motherhood. The moment she learned Mariah had kidnapped Dominic, a cold shock ran straight through her spine, as if the entire city had suddenly shifted its gaze onto her shoulders, heavy enough to change the way she breathed just to keep from collapsing. This wasn't a private mistake anymore. This was a criminal charge that could slam the door on Mariah's future, and it could also shatter the fragile belief Sharon had been clinging to. The belief that her daughter had already endured enough darkness to never be dragged back into it again. But darkness doesn't disappear just because someone wants to believe it did. Sometimes it only retreats, grows more patient, more cunning, and then erupts at the exact moment you think you're finally safe. In her desperation, Sharon went to Michael Baldwin the way a drowning person reaches for the last solid thing in sight. She didn't arrive like someone with a plan. She arrived like someone fleeing a tidal wave. Sharon knew Michael wasn't a man who took cases out of sentiment, and he certainly wasn't the kind of attorney who would gamble his reputation on pity. In Genoa City, Michael was like a heavy door. If you wanted it to open, you had to accept the grinding sound of the hinges. And you had to accept that what was behind it wasn't comfort, it was a surgical room where everything would be cut open, inspected, and stitched back together in whatever way best ensured survival. Sharon came to him with a rough, urgent hope. She needed someone steady enough not to flinch, stubborn enough to face a city's fury, and sharp enough to carve out a defense when every exit felt sealed. Michael listened, but the way he listened made Sharon feel as if she were standing in front of a cold wall. It wasn't because he lacked empathy. It was because he was measuring every detail like someone who understood that one wrong move could crush them all. He emphasized how complicated this kidnapping case was, especially once Mariah was fully exposed and there would be no gray area left to hide in. Sharon understood that all too well. The moment Mariah's name hit the headlines, the moment the story of Dominic being taken got retold in the most sensational way possible, Mariah would become a symbol of betrayal and danger. In Genoa City, people don't judge one act. They judge a whole history, a whole web of relationships, and every sin that was once forgiven. And Mariah's past was already complex enough that anyone who wanted to condemn her could twist it into a verdict before the trial even began. And yet Michael agreed to take the case. That moment felt like Sharon had been pulled back from a cliff only to realize she was being pushed toward another kind of abyss. Because Michael's yes wasn't gentle. It came with conditions, and those conditions demanded a payment Sharon never wanted to make. The very privacy and dignity she was desperate to protect for her daughter. Michael required total cooperation from Sharon and Tessa, absolute, complete, with no omissions and no evasions. He made it clear they had to disclose everything about Mariah's mental health history without hiding even the smallest detail. Because if they held anything back, the prosecution would uncover it anyway, and then the secrecy itself would become proof of deception, collapsing the entire defense. Michael didn't say it like a threat, but the certainty in his voice left Sharon no illusion. This wasn't optional. It was survival. The words mental health history dried Sharon's throat instantly. She knew it was real. She knew Mariah had fought waves inside her mind that outsiders would never see. But Sharon also knew that in Genoa City, mental illness isn't treated purely as a medical reality. It becomes a label, a weapon, a reason to reduce someone to gossip. Sharon's heart tightened around a very specific fear. If those details became public, Mariah would not only be judged for kidnapping Dominic. She would be judged for her fragility itself, as if pain in her mind were evidence she was destined to fall. Sharon wanted to resist, wanted to insist that a mother should never be the one to expose her child's deepest wounds for strangers to dissect. But Sharon also understood bitterly that a courtroom doesn't care about maternal tenderness. A courtroom cares about evidence, motive, capacity, responsibility, and whether a defense can persuade the law to see Mariah as mentally unstable rather than coldly, deliberately criminal. Michael went further. He needed every detail about Mariah's connection to Ian Ward. That name struck Sharon like a splinter driven into memory, a reminder that there are threads in Mariah's life that never fully snap. They only change shape and return at the worst possible time. Michael needed to know how Ian had influenced Mariah, how deep that connection ran, and whether there were signs Mariah had been manipulated, triggered, pushed into a state of instability so severe she acted beyond control. His purpose was clear and unsentimental: to build a defense strategy rooted in Mariah's compromised mental state. That path might spare her the harshest outcome, but it also demanded something brutal from them. They had to speak aloud what they'd been trying to keep inside the family, things that felt humiliating, painful, terrifying, simply because saying them made them real in a way silence never did. Sharon began to split in two. One half of her wanted to protect Mariah from every invasive glance, from being turned into a file instead of a human being. The other half knew that if she rejected Michael's terms, they would walk into a war unarmed. Sharon felt guilt cling to her like wet mud, because somewhere deep inside, she knew this didn't fall from the sky. There had been gaps between mother and daughter, moments when Sharon had been pulled into other fires and convinced herself Mariah was strong enough to stand alone. Sharon had told herself Mariah was grown, Mariah had Tessa, Mariah had survived the worst. But now, facing the demand to reveal every medical and psychological detail, Sharon felt a different kind of pain. Speaking it meant admitting those dark years had never fully disappeared, and admitting that perhaps she hadn't stayed close enough to notice Mariah slipping again. Tessa was caught in the same vice. As Mariah's wife, she didn't want their most private truths turned into legal tools. Some things a spouse wants to keep sacred, not out of shame, but because that intimacy is the purest form of trust. Yet Tessa also knew love couldn't play attorney. Love couldn't stop the prosecution from asking questions. Love couldn't testify instead of facts. Tessa faced crushing pressure as she prepared to reveal secrets Mariah might not even be ready for the world to hear. Every confession they considered felt like a wound opening. Was she saving Mariah or hurting her more? The answer was never clean, because in real life, saving someone sometimes means accepting a lesser cruelty to prevent a greater destruction. Michael offered them no comforting fantasy. He demanded total cooperation because he knew the opposition would show no mercy. He knew public opinion would not soften. He knew that once Mariah's name was tied to Dominic's, Genoa City would want a clean ending, and clean endings in this town usually mean punishment. Michael needed every detail so he could control the narrative before it controlled them. Sharon felt that harshness like cold wind in her face, and yet she also felt the one thing that kept her upright. This was a plan. A painful plan, but still a plan, something firmer than the shapeless panic she had been carrying for days. In the end, Sharon reluctantly accepted every condition Michael set. That reluctance wasn't weakness. It was the weight of understanding what it would cost. She knew exposing Mariah's mental health history could save her from the worst sentence, but it could also stamp her with a permanent mark in the public eye. She knew bringing Ian Ward into the open could prove manipulation, but it could also drag a flood of darkness back into Mariah's life, drowning the progress she'd fought so hard to make. Sharon accepted because she had no other choice, and because in that moment, motherhood overcame fear of judgment. From there, their family entered a kind of preparation no one ever wants to experience. It felt like preparing for a war where nobody is sure they'll survive with their heart intact. Sharon had to learn to speak about her daughter in legal language, something that hurt like betrayal. Tessa had to learn to describe private realities she once swore she would protect. Michael had to stand in the middle, both protector and the one forcing them to face what they had spent years avoiding. The tension didn't come from loud voices. It came from the heavy silence between them, the awareness that one wrong statement, one forgotten detail, one tiny concealment could become the moment everything ends. And if I'm honest, the most haunting part of this story isn't the charge or even the trial date. It's the deeply human helplessness of loving someone so much you're willing to do anything, then realizing that anything might still not be enough to undo what has already happened. Sharon doesn't only fear losing Mariah to prison. She fears losing Mariah to a version of herself Sharon can't recognize anymore. She fears that whether they win or lose, nothing will ever return to what it was. Maybe that's the real tragedy in stories like this. The law can issue a sentence, but no sentence can measure what fractures inside a mother when she is forced to expose her child's wounds just to buy a chance at survival. Sharon stepped away from that decision feeling she had done what was necessary, yet also feeling she had lost a piece of her faith in fairness. Genoa City suddenly felt colder not because of the weather, but because of the eyes that would soon turn on them. And still, the reason no one can look away is what comes next. Because once Sharon and Tessa begin telling Michael everything, what if one detail about Ian Ward, one memory, one hidden connection, one buried trace in Mariah's past doesn't just shock them, but flips the entire case on its head? What if it doesn't only change how Genoa City sees Mariah, but forces Michael to choose between protecting her and admitting that an even more dangerous truth has been hiding in plain sight all along? On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.